listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, support for the coalition is at an all-time low, according to the latest Newspoll. After infighting over the sacking of Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price last week, more voters are turning away from the federal opposition. So what's next for the coalition, and can embattled leader Sussan Ley save a sinking ship? But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Monday, the 15th of September. A sobering new report is warning 1.5 million Australians are at risk from rising sea levels by 2050 unless climate change is curbed. It also projects disasters could cost more than $40 billion a year by mid-century, with a $611 billion hit to property values. Heatwave deaths in Sydney could also increase more than 400%, while in Melbourne they could jump 259%. Climate Change Minister Chris Bowen says the findings are a blunt reminder of the cost of failing to act.
There isn't an Australian community that isn't impacted by climate change going forward, and there isn't an Australian individual for whom those impacts won't be real and material.
The government's highly anticipated emissions reduction target is set to be announced later this week. The ANZ Bank has admitted to widespread misconduct and agreed to pay a record $240 million in penalties. Corporate watchdog ASIC says the bank engaged in unconscionable conduct while managing a $14 billion government bond deal, overstating trading volumes by tens of billions of dollars. ASIC also found ANZ made false statements about interest rates, failed to pay customers what they were owed, and even charged fees to thousands of dead customers. Nearly 65,000 people were affected. Here's ASIC Chair Joe Longo.
Time and time again, ANZ has fallen short and betrayed the trust of Australians. The penalties we are seeking reflect the seriousness and number of breaches of law, the vulnerable position ANZ put its customers in, and the repeated failures to rectify crucial issues. ANZ needs to change. The penalties we're seeking have put ANZ and all other banks on notice. The cost of breaking the law is not an acceptable cost of doing business.
ANZ Chairman Paul O'Sullivan has apologised, saying executives have been held accountable. The penalties still need federal court approval. And history has been made at the 77th Primetime Emmy Awards. Netflix's Adolescents dominated, taking home 6 trophies, including Best Limited Series. The show's co-creator, Stephen Graham, won Best Actor, while 15-year-old Owen Cooper became the youngest ever male Emmy winner.
Tonight proves that if you listen and you focus and you step out your comfort zone, you can achieve anything in life. Like I was nothing about 3 years ago. I'm here now.
Apple's TV Severance scored breakthrough wins, while comedy standout The Studio set a new record with 13 wins across the Emmys, including 4 for co-creator Seth Rogen. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on the federal coalition with Redbridge pollster and former Liberal Party strategist Tony Barry. After its worst election defeat in its party's history, the coalition has broken another record, now recording its worst ever primary result in history. Crashing to an all-time low of 27%, Sussan Ley's promise to rebuild a shattered party looks on shaky ground. But Tony says it's not about personality politics. The Liberal Party has lost its core values and is losing millions of young voters, especially women, in the process. Tony, thanks so much for joining us. We've seen the coalition, unfortunately, break another record for all the wrong reasons. They've recorded their worst primary vote in Newspoll history. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is consistent with all the research that we're finding across the board, and it speaks to a more broader problem the Liberal Party has got. This is not a personality problem for the Liberal Party. It's a brand problem, particularly in those younger generations where the Liberal Party in particular are just no longer even competitive. In fact, the only real cohort where they're contestable is Gen X. And even there, they're struggling. The only cohort they're winning in is the Baby Boomer Plus group. But they're getting slaughtered in Gen Z and the millennial cohorts.
So you also undertook some other research where you really looked into the breakdown with different age groups, female and male as well. What did that show you?
So last Saturday, the Australian Financial Review published our latest poll. It was a large sample size of over 5,000, which means your sort of cross-tabs are more reliable in terms of accuracy. There's a smaller margin of error than on some of those smaller samples. Because what we wanted to do, we wanted to sort of really get in under the hood on these sort of generations, particularly the gender splits as well. Because we've long seen in our research now that Australia is becoming a nation of smaller and smaller tribes. There's this real tribalism and fragmentation in the market. So I go back to, when I first started in politics in the 1990s and the Howard government, Australia was more homogenous in terms of its attitudes and reactions to a lot of issues. So what worked in far north Queensland sort of basically worked in Sydney and effectively worked in Hobart and Perth as well and everywhere in between. But what we're seeing in the last decade in particular is this sort of real fragmentation of the vote. And the more glaring findings in that last survey that we did was that when you go to Gen Z, which is basically voters between the ages of 18 and 28, which is a very significant size cohort, and it's growing and expanding, of course, because every month more of them comes onto the electoral roll. They come of age and they go onto the electoral roll. In that cohort, the Liberal Party primary, the coalition primary vote amongst women, Gen Z, was just 13%.
Gosh.
Now, it's 25% Labor, but 42% Greens. So the Greens are doing exceptionally well with Gen Z women. In the 18 to 28 cohort overall, the coalition got around 18, 19 points. So amongst male Gen Z, they had 22% primary. But that is just simply not even vaguely competitive. So you go back to the Howard era, the coalition used to do pretty well because they did not win the younger voter cohort, but they were kind of, they were in the conversation. But of course, they had a similar lead amongst the older voters, so they kind of cancelled each other out. The younger and older voters sort of cancelled each other out, and then both major parties fought over effectively the mums and dads, those people in their 30s and 40s and early 50s who were very sensitive to cost of living, housing, interest rates, education, health, and so forth. So that was the kind of, the battleground for politics. What we're seeing now is the coalition are getting absolutely slaughtered in those younger cohorts. I mean, the millennial vote was not much better. Amongst males, the primary vote was 28 for the coalition and 25 amongst females. So slightly better, but nowhere near competitive. And that's kind of the biggest challenge facing the coalition, because they're simply not going to be in the race unless they do better in that cohort.
So in regards to the breakdown there, Tony, we know an effective opposition is fundamental to any democracy to keep the current government to account. You said before this is not personality, this is value-driven in fact of what they stand for or what they don't stand for. So is there any way, we know the huge job ahead Sussan Ley has got as leader, is there anything she can do to turn this around?
As always in politics, you need to have a values-based narrative, and your policies need to be a reflection of those values. So, and apologies again for harking back to the Howard era, but it was a successful period for the Liberal Party. So making a comparison there is Howard had some core values and all his policies sort of basically reflected those values. So people knew what he stood for and they knew what he was about. In recent times, the coalition has become very tactical and people don't really know what they stand for, understand what their values are. And so that's why we're seeing some of these sort of blowouts happening in the vote right now.
So in regards to their values, there's been, everyone seems to be an expert right now on what the Liberal Party or coalition should do. There's a school of thought they should go more to the right and go back to where they think the vote may be. But clearly there were monumental disasters in the lead up to the federal election campaign where many people said they just misread, especially the critical young vote.
Yeah. What we're seeing is, voters, those younger voters, that tribalism I spoke of, that fragmentation of the market, they're looking for the party to represent them on the issues that are important to them. So the coalition, to be relevant again with that voter cohort, needs to, in my opinion, get back to its legacy strengths, which is economic management. If I had a criticism of the coalition's campaign last time was it basically vacated the economic narrative to Jim Chalmers, and he's a very effective communicator and performer. And in a cost of living crisis, they were seen as being not the answer because people are still very sceptical about Labor's capacity, but they saw them as less worse than the coalition. So if I was running the coalition strategy, I'd be getting back to its legacy strengths and articulating a narrative that, especially that younger voter cohort, needs to hear to give them the confidence that the coalition represents their values. I mean, Peter Dutton used to say, and unfortunately he didn't execute policies that carried it out, but he used to say that you can't create capitalists if they don't have any capital. In other words, if they don't have any housing or assets like that, they don't tend to hit those conservative milestones where it changes voting behaviour. So what we've seen in the past is that not everyone who buys a house becomes a conservative voter, but you see in the research that people might vote left or centre left, and then they get into the property market and then they've got an asset to conserve, and then they become very invested in the economy and they become very judgmental on what the government is spending its money on. So the coalition really sort of, they're not going to be competitive unless people have got capital, and housing is the political fault line in Australia right now.
Interesting when you break down those statistics from your research and also from Newspoll. Some of the voters that were surveyed with Newspoll were heading towards One Nation, considering the fallout and infighting with the coalition last week, which was incredibly damaging. Your research showed a lot of voters were swinging towards the Greens. Do you think that division in the vote and going towards the minor parties, you mentioned there before, Tony, the voters are saying it's the lesser of two evils. Do you think we have a big structural problem in today's world with those two major parties that are just not cutting through to what voters need right now?
Yeah, our poll also picked up a significant movement to One Nation, about 5 points, but we found that was mostly in the Gen X male. 17% of Generation X men said they would vote One Nation. Now, that's a very significant number across Australia, but it speaks to what we've seen in qualitative research or focus groups, which is pervading sense of frustration that, they missed out on the housing boom. They sort of bought after house prices started really escalating. So they've still got massive mortgages. They feel they're getting passed over in the workplace, that they're sort of not as financially secure as they want to. And they sort of feel that, so-called political correctness, or I guess woke politics, if you want to use that expression, is impacting their lives. Now, that's a small segment, but that is where it's most prevalent in our research, is Generation X men who are just basically feeling like both major parties aren't standing up for them anymore.
So if you were running the Liberal Party right now, you touched on it previously, Tony, what would you do? Because the big question is now, I guess two questions, can the Liberal Party turn this around? And also, is Sussan Ley safe as a leader?
So you're always hesitant to sort of say something is existential crisis, because I've been around for a fair while. When Houston lost in 1993, Senator Chris Bufflick, a Liberal senator in New South Wales, wrote a book, Is the Party Over?, where he fearlessly predicted it would never win again. And I think Gerard Henderson wrote a book called Menzies' Child, which had a similar thesis. It wasn't as catastrophic, but he put forward the same thesis. And of course, John Howard won 93 seats, the same that Albanese won last election, only 18 months later. So you always want to be careful when you're making these fearless predictions. But what I keep reminding people is Houston, when he lost in 1993, had a primary vote of 44.2%. Now, at the moment, the coalition are in the low 30s. So that actually killed for 44.2% primary vote right now. So yes, these fearless predictions have been made before, but the coalition has to grow at least 10 to 12 points in its primary vote in an environment where Labor's also losing vote share as well. because people are more attracted to the minor parties or litmus test parties. So it's a huge challenge. And the big problem for the coalition is its whole electoral model is built on a primary vote of 45% or thereabouts to win on a 2PP basis in a majority of seats. As a yardstick, that's what the coalition's always going for, a 45% primary. It just simply can't win with a vote in the low 30s. They don't get the preference flows from the minor parties. Most minor parties preference Labor. The Greens, of course, you can always rely on for about 10 points, about 8 or 9 points of their vote. So the coalition has to completely rethink how it goes about its business. But more importantly, it needs to connect with those younger generations. Voting can become habit forming. And if they don't hit those conservative milestones until much, much later in life, buying a home and so forth, or not even being able to afford a home, there's a real possibility that the coalition will not see government again for several terms. So, changing leader, the Liberal Party is always great at finding scapegoats and looking for a messiah. And it's not personality driven. It's a failure to connect with that, as you referenced, a structural vote problem.
We really appreciate your analysis. Let's see how this plays out. Tony, thank you.
Thank you, Natasha.
That was pollster Tony Barry from Redbridge. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. And we'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.